Welcome everyone to Spotify's IAB podcast Upfront, and I'm delighted that we are here, brought to you via a vodcast, which is a member of the podcast family tree. I'm Patel, and I'm head of sales for UK and Panamea at Spotify. And over the space of the next 20 to 25 minutes, we are going to explore all things love audio, digital audio, and of course, really focusing on podcasts and how they've had a meteoric rise from niche to what they are now, such a companion to all consumers. Now, for those of you that have tuned in via the vodcast, you will see that I am in what I think is a pretty sensational Hawaiian shirt. And that is in homage to our brilliant guest that we have today. So he is not only one of, if not the most influential people within the advertising industry, he is a podcast host himself. I'm delighted to say that we have Rory Sutherland with us today. Now, Rory is vice chairman, as you all know. He needs no introduction, but he's vice chairman of Ogilvy UK and an expert on consumer behaviour, trends, and the influence of the internet. Before founding Ogilvy's behavioural science practice, Rory was a copywriter and creative director at Ogilvy for over 20 years, having joined them as a graduate in 1988. He has been president of the IPA, chair of the judges for the direct jury at Cannes, and has spoken at TED Global. It doesn't stop there. He writes regular columns for The Spectator, Market Leader, and Impact, and also occasional pieces for Wired. He's the author of two quite brilliant books, The Wikiman, available on Amazon at prices between £1.94 and £2,345.54, dependent upon whether the algorithm is having a bad day or good day, dependent upon your perspective, and the best-selling Alchemy, The Surprising Power of Ideas Which Don't Make Sense. Welcome, Rory.
Oh, it's a huge pleasure to be on. I'm delighted. Thank you.
Great to have you here. And I've got to start with this Hawaiian shirt. I mean, what do you think? Is this okay? Is it to your is it near your standard?
It's pretty fine. It's less necessary for you than it is for me. And there's a very simple reason for this, which is I think the Hawaiian shirt encapsulates a brilliant bit of behavioral psychology, which is it's the psychological solution to the obesity crisis. Because it's a very strange item of clothing in the sense that the bigger you are, the better they look. So if you think about it, you've got to have at least a reasonable level of rotundity to carry off, Tom Selleck or up.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, look, no doubt I'll need to be wearing these sort of Hawaiian shirts as the years start to stack up. So look, I want to start with, the obviously quite crazy last 6 months that we've had and the change that it's had on, all our behaviors and in particular working life. How's your working life changed? Are you finding that you're much more efficient? Are you yearning for human interaction or are you missing the odd, global conference stage, Rory?
I think, no, funnily enough, I don't miss the travel at all. I don't miss the commuting at all. I think I've been more productive and I think I've generally had a better quality of life at the same time. One of my clients, in fact, said that he'd worked harder, produced better work per hour, and had a happier time. So there was no way he was going back to the status quo ante. I think there's something very interesting about the whole thing, actually, which is that a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, all of us believed that we ourselves could, of course, work remotely and at home because we were trustworthy and highly committed people, but we never believed that everybody else could do it. And it took a kind of enforced experiment like this to discover that, in fact, what works individually also works at scale. And I think nobody suspected it beforehand. A lot of people aren't going back. The number of businesses which basically say, at the very least, we're going to be 3-2 in perpetuity, 3 days working at home, 2 in the office. And that's not just kind of weird ad agencies or tech firms, which tend to be quite experimental or like to show off about how open-minded they are. These are really boring banks are doing the same thing as well.
Rory, you mentioned about the conversation with your clients. So tell the audience that's listening, just in terms of how's that conversation evolved over the last 6 months or so? What are you seeing, across the board and maybe in pockets as well?
Well, I see vindicated a little bit of what I used to say. One of them is that the problem with big data is it all comes from the same place, the past. And you can have accumulated a huge amount of data and information on listening habits, viewing habits, and everything else. And then one major event changes everything. And I think will change it a large part in perpetuity, by the way. Shopping habits will change. Travel habits, business travel habits will change immensely, I think. And so one of the other things I think it demonstrates is that perhaps marketing is economically much more important than we think. And I think what it demonstrates is that the very fact that you can have a technology like Zoom, which suddenly gets adopted and sticks, suggests that in many cases, the big obstacles to progress, economic, environmental, technological progress, are psychological obstacles in the level of, consumer behavior. They're not the old-fashioned economic constraints of supply and distribution. And I think we've had a bit of a kind of crash course in understanding that more and more business questions are really behavioral questions, they're marketing questions, and that business's traditional focus on kind of tedious cost-cutting and efficiency drives only takes you so far.
And so how's that sort of evolved, particularly over the last 5 to 10 years, as clearly audio and audio advertising, we're sat here at a podcast Upfront that's been run by the IAB. I mean, how have attitudes changed, would you say, and are they changing for the better?
Well, first of all, we've got to look at how people are listening differently now, because obviously drive time probably isn't what it was. The fact that, of course, that these are now streamed rather than downloaded gives you an extra level of measurement. The fact that you have these large networks, including Spotify, means that actually, although this is a long tail, in other words, there are a hell of a lot of podcasts with relatively few listeners. When you aggregate the whole thing, you have a pretty good mass audience. Nonetheless, that's another really important thing, looking at how I've always said that radio, a bit like cigarettes and coffee, is the natural entertainment of the productive. Because, whatever you think about smoking or drinking coffee or listening to the radio, it's the thing that hardworking people do, because you can do it at the same time as doing something useful. You can't get pissed out of your head, and you can't watch television while doing useful work. But you'll notice that carpenters, builders, but equally working from home business people are going to have audio on in the background. Because it's the natural mode of, hardworking people, is to have something which entertains you and distracts you without preventing you from getting on with something useful.
Exactly.
And so it's really valuable there. There's also something, by the way, I'd love to delve into this. I think there's also something really deep about audio. So I was a classicist at university, and I remember reading Homer, which is, in the original Greek, right? But I mean, it was written, nobody's quite sure, 600 BC, 700 BC. And there's this strange single passage in Homer, which they're not even sure is genuine, in which someone sends someone a block of stone on which were engraved strange signs. And we all thought this was pretty weird when we were reading this. They said, you realize, well, this is really significant. It's pretty much the first ever literary reference to writing. What? So writing is like 2,500 years old. In evolutionary time, it's a blip, It's a flicker at the very end of evolutionary time. Whereas speech and listening to speech and stories and storytelling, they're about, well, let's take a guess, 250,000 years old, So the way in which speech gets into your head, and the speed, by the way, of transmission, is just more effortless than reading, but it also perhaps taps into parts of the brain which print can't reach. And so that really fascinates me, the fact that there's something kind of magical about radio, because it's a far more ancient, it's an older medium than TV by 20 years. But on the other hand, the kind of information it carries, if I can get a bit Marshall McLuhan, that's age-old form of storytelling versus the comparatively newfangled idea of text, which is practically the internet in evolutionary history. It's that recent.
And on that as well, because something our founder and CEO Daniel talked about maybe a few years ago or so was, why are eyes 10 times more worthy than the ears? And obviously that's been a strategy at Spotify in terms of owning the ear and so on. So that really plays into that. And do you actually see that value of the ear has changed and evolving in relation to what you sort of touched on there?
Well, there's another thing which also applies to vodcasting as well, by the way, which is a product of COVID, which we shouldn't forget. And I call this thing Sutherland's Law, slightly egotistically, which is my general...
How many is there? How many laws have you got?
Well, it was, funny enough, a TV program featuring Ian Cuthbertson in the 1970s, but no one in WPP will remember that, of course, because they're all under 30. Oops, didn't say that. But the interesting thing with Sutherland's Law is that my contention is that practically everybody on the planet, apart from David Beckham and Bill Clinton, will give you an hour of their time on Zoom or on a podcast for somewhere between naught and $1,000, maybe pounds, if you're getting really generous, okay? But there are not many people on the planet who, if you said, tell you what, I'd like an hour of your time virtually, in other words, a virtual hour of your time, I don't have to fly to Amsterdam, I don't have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, there's no big opportunity cost, it doesn't prevent me going on holiday that week, okay? I can do that damn thing from Barbados if I want to, not that I'll be going to Barbados for about 5 years, but on principle I could, okay? And so the fact that you can get really, really interesting people to talk to you really, really easily, I'm pretty confident Nobel Prize winners, now this is, by the way, particularly interesting for B2B, because if you think about it, we should give a lot of thought about podcasting and B2B, because in B2B, the principal mode of communication was F to F. It was face to face. And that's not going to be happening anymore. I mean, no one's going to want to have a conference, a trade fair, a trade exhibition, and risk having their brand attached to a super spreading event. Okay, it's too big a risk. It's too big a reputational risk. And so a huge amount of B2B, everything from small-scale business meetings to large-scale conferences and events, is going to have to be reinvented digitally in some form over the next year and a half.
Of course.
And that fascinates the hell out of me, because the possibility to take business conversation out of the boardroom and onto the airwaves, as it were, is really, really interesting.
Yeah.
So I've just started talking to an organization called Speakers for Schools. And I said, why don't you create a little extension called Conferences for Schools? And if there's a business conference on something quite interesting, just allow kids to attend for free. Maybe only 20 of them will, but that's 20 people who never realized that there was a career in kind of aircraft interior design or something like that. Yeah. So this possibility to take things out of the face-to-face arena, which was heavily weighted towards senior people who probably didn't need to be there, and where most of the money went on accommodation and transportation. Suddenly this can be redirected to content instead. And, as I said, if you asked me, it would take me a couple of days, but I could get a Nobel Prize winner on a podcast, if you gave me a budget of 500 quid and 2 days of my time. That's magical. Fantastic.
Of course it is, and incredibly fascinating, and really sort of, that's only the tip of the iceberg. That's clearly one reason why, your On-Brand podcast is sensational. It's the Bible of podcasts within the advertising industry. Now,
really one of many. It's part of the ecosystem.
Of course. What drew you to it? What there you talked about one scope, which is around the types of guests you could potentially go on. What drew you to podcasts as a medium?
The very fact that I could do it from anywhere. Again. I tend to work from home on Fridays. They tend to be recorded on Fridays. It is extraordinarily pleasurable. I get to meet some really, really interesting people. Other people seem to really enjoy the conversations. I learn as much as I contribute from each of the interviews. Altogether, it's just a fantastic pleasure to do.
Great. Where's it going? Where do you see it going? We had a fascinating conversation about this, didn't we? About long form and short form and so on. I'd love you to share that with the audience today.
There's an enhancement I'd like, and I tried to get Spotify to do this a few years ago, and they didn't. And I wanted the link with Waze so that you could pod your journey. So if my sat-nav, i.e. Waze, told me my journey was going to take an hour and 30 minutes, it would provide me with an hour and 15 minutes worth of podcast. I left the 15 minutes at the end of the journey silent, because that's when your sat-nav's telling you turn left, turn right, don't go there, go straight on. But for the bulk of the journey, where you're just ploughing down a motorway, if you could have a thing that compiled podcasts in a way that was suited to your particular time frame, that would be a real bonus for me. And I think that's just one behavioral enhancement you could add to podcasting software. Sometimes I want 30 minutes. I'm going to go. I'm a massive fan of True Life Crime Case File, for example. There's a great British one, All Killer No Filler, which is two female Mancunian comedians talking about serial killers, which I don't think anybody would have taken that to the commissioning editor of Law, would they really? We're going to do a comedy program about Ed Gein, okay. Yeah. Dennis Nielsen, let's find the comedy potential in that. And you also get wonderful things, Beef and Dairy Network, which is so surreal and brilliant. I don't know if you're familiar with it. But it's a comedy podcast which pretends to be a deadly serious specialist business podcast on beef and dairy farming, while basically incorporating elements of the completely surreal and the ridiculous.
That's fantastic.
And it's particularly clever. But that's what I love, is the low-cost ingenuity here. And comedians tell me, because I hang out with them occasionally when I can, they always tell me they're really grateful, because Radio 4 kind of was a bit of a, getting into Radio 4 comedy was a lot harder than becoming a made man in the Gambino family. It was really difficult to break into. And now they said the great thing about podcasting is we have this whole experimental space.
Absolutely.
Which is really, really tremendous.
Yeah. And we see it on our platform.
Yeah, it's brilliantly Darwinian, and you'll see things which suddenly come from nowhere and break through.
Oh, totally right. And true crime as well is one of our outstanding genres. It really is. 70% of all true crime listeners are female as well. So,
this is fascinating, alarming, isn't it?
And my wife loves them as well. So there we go. But you did reference there just in terms of the commute and so on, and actually something to do watch his space. We've actually launched something in the US for a little while called Your Daily Drive, which does exactly that. It's a combination of podcasts, so the spoken word with your favorite music as well. So that's something that hopefully you'll hear more on as we end the year. Now, obviously the folk that we have on the podcast are marketing and advertising professionals. What they're talking to brands all the time, or are from brands. What should brands be thinking about when thinking about the podcast space, audio space? What are the sort of things that you think should be sort of top of mind?
One of the things would be just use this to be more experimental. Okay. And the same applies to all digital media. There's a bit of a tragedy in marketing, which is that we tend to get siloed. So you get a digital guy, and you get you might even get a radio guy, and you get a TV guy. And the problem is the metrics in those silos are all the same metrics. And they tend to be optimization metrics where you can't afford to experiment, because your best approach is always incremental improvement and, efficiency gains. And my argument is those fast fail media like digital, programmatic, and radio, they should actually have about 50% of their budget should be experimental. Because I always love this phrase, I learned it from Matt Ridley, which is biology is the science of exceptions. And I think marketing is really the science of exceptions. We've got it wrong. We're trying to develop these universal rules for marketing, which are universally true, like Newtonian physics, and they don't exist. What you need to do is take a Darwinian mindset and wander around the Galapagos Islands until you discover something that's really unusual or unexpected, and try and then understand what's happening there. And so that's what really interests me, is that the experimentation point is that in those media where you can kill your failures really fast, what you should be looking for, again, this is what worries me about people introducing AI and all this data stuff, is it's great, but most of the people are using the wrong maths. Okay, they're fundamentally using the wrong statistical models to try and understand what's going on. And you can be hugely confident and massively wrong at the same time if you do that. If you use the wrong maths, essentially, to analyze data, you can have complete confidence in what the model's telling you, while basically being utterly wrong because of some rogue confounding variable or whatever. And so the vital thing, I think, is that these media which are less expensive should receive more attention, because they should be the experimental space. I mean, I'll give you an example from the behavioral science practice. How do you sell dollar fries for KFC in Australia? Well, it turned out after a ton of experimentation, the most powerful line to sell dollar fries is maximum 4 per customer. Now, it was buried in the legal lines before. It was written by a lawyer, and someone just decided, well, scarcity bias. People actually are compelled to buy things if they feel there's a limitation on them. And sure enough, not only did the volume of fries go up massively, but the number of people buying 4 also went up massively.
Brilliant.
And that's one of those things where you won't discover it through logic. There isn't any data that'll tell you that. That's the kind of area where you need to be using these niche forms of communication to make your next breakthrough. That's my view.
Yeah, got it. I've got one final question actually, and that's very much centered again, something that I know both of us have discussed in the past. So digital audio in particular, we've seen real fast strides and evolution over the space of the last 18 months, and clearly the last 6 months have really sort of propagated the consumption of digital audio. Do you see similarities with digital video and what video went through, say 15, 10 odd years ago or so?
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of intertwined. And by the way, the vodcast, I think, will grow quite often. I mean, the video is kind of optional. I mean, that's an interesting question about online business conferences, because when I speak at a conference or attend a conference online, for about a third of the day it's television and 2/3 of the day it's radio. So I get on with some emails and things and listen in the background and, look up when it's necessary.
Yeah.
And so understanding that, and actually the fact that they're quite close in certain forms, they're actually quite closely intertwined. I think is really interesting. I also can see a really interesting thing, which is that among business people, the old-fashioned status moniker or marker of the BA Gold Executive Club or the Virgin, whatever it is, Flying Club Gold Card, will be replaced by incredibly elaborate recording and filming equipment. In 2 years' time, I won't travel anywhere at all, but I'll have some sort of weird Leica video conferencing.
Yeah, absolutely. Your own little studio.
With 3 cardioid microphones hanging in front of me instead. That'll turn really interesting as well, I think.
On that note, and what a lovely image to leave us with, to finish this brilliant interview. Rory, you've been absolutely fantastic, as we knew you were going to be. Thank you so much. As always, sharing some brilliant insights for the audience today.
Look, more power to your elbow. Anything I can do to support this medium is great with me, because I love it as an advertiser, but I also love it as a consumer. So
fantastic. There you go.
All the best of luck to you. That's all I can say.
Thank you so much, Rory. Thank you so much for joining today. And everyone else, thank you for joining and tuning in. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.